Hi, I'm Deacon Jeff, and this is our reflection for Friday, June 11th, 2021. I've really lucked out on the reflections that I've gotten to do since I've been assigned to the new Cities of God group. Today is a wonderful day to be able to do a reflection because it is the solemnity of the most sacred heart of Jesus. A beautiful feast holiday for the church, one of the highest ranks, even up there almost with Easter and Christmas. And it commemorates the Sacred Heart of Jesus being an everlasting symbol of God's infinite love for us. And our readings for Mass today reflect that imagery. So I could talk about the readings today. I could talk about how in our first reading from the prophet Hosea, he talks about how God is so loving. He's like a loving mother whose heart would be broken if anything were to happen to us as children. Or I could talk about how St. Paul in Ephesians writes about how God's love is infinite and immense, so great that we can never possibly grasp the breadth and depth of that love. Or I could go a completely different direction and maybe talk about some of the history of the devotion to the Sacred Heart, how our gospel reading today actually is one of the sources of this devotion, where Christ's side is pierced by the Roman centurion as he hangs upon the cross, and blood and water flows forth, and how that Roman centurion, now known as Saint Longinus, became the first Christian convert after Christ's death. As early as that this goes, and I could talk about how this devotion was even practiced by the early church fathers, by Origen and Saints Ambrose and Hippolytus and Augustine, and how it was even part of the spirituality of some of the great saints in the Middle Ages, like Saint Gertrude or Saint Bernard. And I could then, if I wanted to, talk about how it became much more widespread as a result of the efforts of St. John Eudes, a top doctor of the church who wrote an entire Mass, and how it really became widespread after the visions of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque became well known. But instead of talking about all those people, I would really like to talk about just a regular guy. A guy who I'm sure most of you, probably none of you, have ever even heard of. A guy named Stefan Jasinski. Stefan was born in 1914 in Vilnius, Lithuania. He was part of a Polish noble family. His father was a very successful businessman who moved his family in 1932 to Warsaw, where Stefan then entered into the University of Warsaw to study art and architecture. While he was a student there, he became part of what we would now consider something like the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. The university program in Poland in those days was not just 4 years, it was longer. And in 1939, as we all know, World War II came to Poland. Stefan was unable to finish his studies. He was immediately taken into a cavalry unit of the Polish army, an armored brigade that engaged the Nazi army repeatedly, and repeatedly was defeated and pushed back out of Poland, all the way into France, all the way across France, and ultimately all the way up to the English Channel. Stefan ultimately fled to England, where he made contact with the Polish army in exile, continued to serve. In 1941, he was promoted to an officer, and in 1942, he was sent to military intelligence school to learn how to be a spy. In 1943, he parachuted out of an airplane over Poland, made contact with the partisans in Poland, what was known as the Home Army, the army in Poland, now occupied by Germany, and was sent to the Eastern Front to report on the movements of the German units who were engaging the Russian army on the Eastern Front. In 1944, he was called back to Warsaw. Having been very successful as a spy on the Eastern Front, they had a special mission for him. He was being assigned to identify the circumstances and situation around Auschwitz. It was believed by the Polish military at that time that the Germans intended to execute all of the prisoners of Auschwitz, to exterminate them all, in order to cover up what they believed was a genocide taking place there. So Stefan Jasienski made contact with the resistance in the camp at great risk to find out what the situation was. He made contact with the partisans in the area. He reconnoitered the area to find out what the German strength was in the area, and then was asked what options the Poles had. Initially, it was suggested that they do an armed attack on the camp. That was rejected because it was determined that the German strength was simply too great. They also thought about potentially doing an arms drop, a weapons drop into the camp. Again, that also was rejected. He was sent back to try and come up with additional options. On September 29th, 1944, in a Nazi ambush, Stefan Jasienski was shot and captured, and he was then taken to the military prison of Auschwitz. He died under unexplained circumstances in January of 1945. The war ended just a few short months after that. And up until that time, that was all that was known of him, until much more recently. In recent years later, it was discovered in cell block 11, a concrete walled cell block in Auschwitz, a cell just around the corner from the cell of another Auschwitz prisoner, St. Maximilian Kolbe. And in this cell were found etchings in the concrete walls that were identified as having been done by Second Lieutenant Stefan Jasienski. On one wall, off to one side, was a detailed etching in the concrete of a crucifix with the corpus of Christ hanging upon it. On the other wall, on the opposite side, approximately a foot, 2 feet high, was an etching in the concrete wall made with his fingernails of a detailed portrait of Jesus Christ. Long flowing hair, beard, a halo, robes, and in the center of his chest, an image of the most Sacred Heart of Jesus. But significantly, below that image of the Sacred Heart, there's another image of a man in profile, looking up at the Sacred Heart with his arm around Jesus' waist and the arm of Christ around his shoulder. They knew whose cell it was because the image of the man looking up at Jesus' Sacred Heart is a self-portrait carved in the concrete wall with his fingernails of Stefan Jasienski. He died at Auschwitz, knowing that as he was going to his death, he was being held in the embrace of the loving Christ, an image that he put on the wall of his cell, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, an eternal image of God's great love for us. Have a blessed solemnity of the Sacred Heart.